I know you are here to listen to the book Ajita. Let me introduce our speaker to the audience. Professor Sridhar currently teaches at the Azim Premji University. But for more than 2 decades, he was associated with the Department of Theoretical Physics, Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, Mumbai. His area of work is theoretical high energy physics, and his research in the field is spread over several subdomains, which includes brain worlds and extra dimensions, supersymmetry, symmetry, quantum chromodynamics, and electroweak physics and other areas. I'm not doing justice to his profile by just keeping it this short. However, his work and concerns extends beyond physics to art, philosophy, and education as well. His first book, in fact, was a literary fiction called Twice Written, published in 2011. Ajita is a second novel. And I'm also told that he also writes poetry, which he rarely publishes. On that introduction, may I now invite Professor Sridhar to take stage. And it's up to you if you want to stand here, if you want to sit and talk. You can sit and talk. I'll give the mic to you. And we have changed the format just because we have a visitor that is coming to listen to Ajita. But yeah,
I'm very, very sorry for being late. And this is something completely beyond one's control, of course. We know that in Bangalore. But I wanted to say this, that Ajita has waited for more than 2,500 years for his story to be heard. So if we give him an extra half an hour, I think we are not being asked to do too much. So with that, let me begin. I mean, who is Ajita? And let me set the context for this book. There are, I think, copies which, if you don't have a copy, you can actually buy those copies from here. This cover is actually designed by a very, very well-known artist. Very well-known is, in fact, an understatement. Nalini Malani. She very kindly agreed to do the cover for this book. So the thing is, I mean, it's appropriate that in a Academy of Indian Heritage, we start this discussion with a discussion of Indian philosophy and what Indian philosophy is understood as by us. So the contemporary understanding of what we call Indian philosophy, I mean, I'm talking of okay, I mean, very often philosophy, of course, gets mixed up with religion. So there is that thing, that overlap cannot be ignored, but I'm talking of philosophy per se, not so much religion. And when we talk of philosophy, we very often talk about Vedanta. And this has been true right from the 19th century, because from the 19th century, from the colonial period, Vedanta has been the way people have talked about Indian systems. Vedanta is very, very intellectually attractive. It's a very complex philosophy. But to say that everything in Indian systems boils down just to Vedanta is very, very reductive. Okay. Of course, when we use the word Indian, we also have to consider that there have been many different religious traditions in this. So, but even what we now accept as the Hindu tradition, in that there were 6 systems of orthodox philosophy. Okay, which, I mean, so if you go back to the Vedic period, these 6 systems existed, and those are various, I mean, called, there's Vaisheshika philosophy, which has a corroborating philosophy called Nyaya. So Nyaya and Vaisheshika go together as a team. Then there is Sankhya, and its practical aspects is yoga. So Sankhya and Yoga are the two philosophical systems that go together. And then there is traditionally what is called Purva Mimamsa and Uttara Mimamsa. Purva Mimamsa is very often referred to just as Mimamsa, and Uttara Mimamsa is what we understand now as Vedanta. Uttara Mimamsa comes from the latter portions of the Vedas, so that's another reason why it's called Vedanta. And of course, this is all I'm talking about, at least something like 700 years or 800 years before Christ. These things were already existing. They got codified at various times, and in this whole business, dates are a very, very treacherous thing. So depending on which side of the political spectrum you are, the dates are quoted very, very differently. But there is a lot of ambiguity about dates, so I'm not even going to get into that kind of thing. But much after this, in fact, it was almost 1500 years or even more after this period that we had in Kerala, we had Adi Shankaracharya, and it was Shankaracharya who he was responsible for the resurgence of what is called Advaita Vedanta, and very often people confuse all these things. I mean, very often this period between the Vedic period and Shankara has just collapsed into one, whereas if you look at it, Buddha was something like 1400 years or so before Shankara, and Shankara is in fact much closer to our period than he was to Buddha's period. But we just, in our minds and in our learnings of Indian history, we just collapse these dates as though nothing existed in between. What is also very interesting is, other than these 6 systems of orthodox philosophy I talked about, are what are called the heterodox systems, and people usually mention Jainism and Buddhism as heterodox. So between orthodox and heterodox, the difference really is that systems which accepted the authority of the Vedas and systems which did not accept the authority of the Vedas. Which does not mean that these other systems debunk the Vedas altogether. All they said was that you cannot put an end to an argument in a debate by saying that this is quoted in the Vedas and this is what the Vedas say. So that is something that the heterodox systems did not accept. They thought that the Vedas contain a lot of valuable information, but they said that even what is contained in the Vedas is always acceptable for scrutiny, whereas the orthodox systems didn't say so. But among the heterodox system, there were other schools, and they were in fact the Ajivikas. And I just want to know, can I ask how many of you have heard of the Ajivikas? Yes, okay, there's one person at least here. But it's really interesting to contemplate that around 500 BC and going all the way down to Ashoka, which is about for 300 or 400 years in that period, Ajivikas were the biggest religion in India. Okay. And it's something we, so completely obliterated from our memories that it's very strange. So we have a very, very complex history, which I think we need to look into, and that is one of the impulses of this book. Ajita, whom I'm talking about, was not an Ajivika, but he belonged to another school who were called the Cārvākas. The Cārvākas were the first, now they are acknowledged as the first materialists anywhere in the world. And what does materialism mean? Materialism means that you accept only matter as the ultimate entity, that at the elementary level, that it's all matter, and everything that comes is coming out of matter. So this is quite a profound position, especially to take in 500 BC. And it also has implications for us as humans. So the Cārvākas said we are just us, our bodies, and nothing else. And in fact, Ajita is claimed to have said that the Buddha and idiot will both burn on the funeral pyre in the same way. We don't take anything with us, and this all ends here. Okay? So it's rather, it's a, stark kind of philosophy in some sense, but in a sense also very modern in a way, because our modern ideas, especially in physics, are certainly very materialistic, and they so in physics also, for example, today we believe that at the very elementary level it's all some very fundamental matter which have some names called quarks and leptons and so on, and these come together and form atoms, and these atoms again come together to form molecules, and you can get more complex molecules, and eventually you have proteins. And suddenly between proteins and then suddenly something happens, and then there is the DNA, and there is organic matter, there's life. And where this transition occurs is still, of course, not very, fully, nowhere fully understood in present day science. I mean, this is one of the very, very hot areas of research. But the point is that we believe that when you take clumps, when you take composites of inanimate matter, of non-living matter, and put them together, life emerges suddenly somehow. I mean, this idea of emergence is a very, very important idea, and it's driving a lot of research in a lot of areas in academics. But I'm going to stick my neck out and say, and I've said it in other fora, that the very, very first people who came up with this idea of emergence were the Cārvākas. Okay. In fact, the Buddhists who thought of the Cārvākas as, they didn't take them very seriously. So they mocked them and they said, what do you mean that everything is, we are just our bodies? Okay. You may not be using it much, but even you have to accept that there is something called a mind. Okay. And these guys then replied, and it's a very significant reply, saying that if you consider matter at a very basic level, it is just, if you consider things at a very basic level, it's just matter. But when you take composites of matter, this is explicitly said by the Cārvākas, if you take composites of matter, then the mind, life, consciousness, even self-awareness, all these emerge. So chunks of matter show properties which individual bits do not show. So this idea of emergence, we can actually say actually comes out of, I'm paraphrasing them in a somewhat modern language, which is something I've done throughout this book. But the grain of this idea of emergence already existed with them. And I think that's a very important thing. So anyway, so this was my impulse to tell the story of someone like one of the philosophers from the Cārvāka school. Ajita Keshakamlin, which was his full name, was certainly one of the most prominent of these philosophers. And so I thought of telling his story. Okay. Except that I didn't tell his story finally. It is actually been told by another person called Moksh Malhar, who is also a character in my book. So if you have any problems with the way I've told Ajita's story, then I think you should not blame me. You should contact Moksh Malhar instead. I think he's still around and alive, and he lives in Gamdevi in Bombay. I have his email address if someone wants to contact him. And I think he was working in Bombay University in the philosophy department, probably just retired. Okay, he should be around that age to retire. And okay. So Moksh is the other character in my book. Ajita is, I'm sorry to take that literary deviation. Moksh is, of course, a fictional character. Ajita was a historical character. But then that is what this book deals with a lot. What is history? What is fiction? Okay. And this is where I think I should start my reading maybe. Can I read? Would you be interested? Yeah. Geeta, my wife, told me that I should keep markers on the pages so that I'm not struggling to find the page. I put so many markers now, I don't know which marker to look for. So things happen. And a couple of my students are sitting in the audience and they know that I'm not a very organized teacher also. So they learned in spite of my messing around in the class. Okay. So I'm just reading this conversation between Moksh and his friend, whose name is Ananya, but Moksh keeps calling her Ono. And I'll just get into the middle of the conversation and start. So Moksh starts by saying, I found myself getting more interested in the question, why did this person do this when he or she did? To get to the bottom of this, I need to comprehend the person's inner life. How did he feel when someone hurt him, or when she felt love for the first time, or when her mother died? These tiny rivulets flow into the river we term history. But I thought you were writing philosophy, not history. Well, that is one more schism. This is one more schism. Philosophy is positioned with respect to history, like history is with respect to fiction. Philosophy gives up on the person while moving further from history. Even the river dries up. In my writing, I return to philosophy energized by history. So from here you move to fiction then? I think fiction will give me the freedom to go beyond the text, to move from the text, then return to it, but to be unfettered in between, where one listens to the soft music of lived experiences, of joys, of sorrows, of even boredom. History will dub these contingent. Its quest is for necessity. But in fiction, contingency does not get excluded, but gets blurred with necessity. Necessity seems much less forbidding in fiction. So Ananya responds by saying, it looks like you know very well where this book is going. If I know you well, I know you'll do it once your mind is set. So my verdict is do it. I needed you to tell me just this. Okay. This is when Moksh, who has started thinking of writing a book about Ajita, decides to write it as fiction and not as an academic book. Originally, he thought of writing it as a philosophy book, and then eventually he makes it instead of making it a boring academic non-fiction, he decides to rewrite it as a fictional book. Okay. So that was Moksh. Maybe I should follow it up by reading something from Ajita, which I'll do quickly. But as I said, there were these Ajivikas, and the Ajivikas were a very, very interesting group of philosophers. When Romila Thapar did her PhD in the School of Oriental and African Studies in the UK, she did her PhD with a prominent historian called Basham. Basham has written a book called The Wonder That Was Aimed, if you know. And but Basham, when he did his PhD thesis, he did his PhD work on Ajivikas. Okay, so one of the best published accounts of the Ajivikas is Basham's PhD thesis. And the Ajivikas, they were just like one of the most prominent people in the Cārvāka school was Ajita. The Ajivikas had a very, very interesting leader of the school, whose name was Makkhali Goshala. Makkhali Goshala was senior person. He was a little older than Ajita. He was a little older than the Buddha. He was a little older than Mahavira. And these people all lived around the same time. It is said, but not fully accepted, that both Buddha and Mahavira did apprenticeships with Makkhali Goshala at different points of time, but fell out of that system, and then chose their own paths. But he was a guru to all these people. Okay, so there is no historical evidence for this scene. I have just imagined this scene where Ajita's friend Maitreya takes him to meet Makkhali Goshala. And Ajita is, as I told you, called Ajita Keshakamlin. Keshakamlin literally means someone blanket of hair, and someone probably looking like me maybe. But I have imagined Keshakamlin as a name coming from his detractors, people who wanted to make fun of him. Otherwise, who in his right mind would call himself Keshakamlin? But Ajita is like my students would say, he's a cool dude. You know, he lives in the city, he lives in Vaishali. He's chosen to leave his village and come and live in Vaishali. Again, all these things I have imagined. And he's an urbanized guy. And in fact, it's a very important thing to realize that the cities were first emerging around that time in Bihar. And those cities have more or less remained like that for the last 2,500 years in Bihar. But the cities, the urbanization was something that was just happening at that time. And Ajita was, in that sense, a very much a city person, so wanted to look a particular way. He had long hair, but he tended to it in a way that, that is becoming of a city person. Okay. Goshala, on the other hand, is completely different. Okay. I'll just again start reading somewhere. When they reached the house where Goshala was staying, they were told that he was close to completing his period of silence and that they should wait. Goshala appeared older than Ajita had imagined. He was quite a sight with his long, unruly, matted hair and beard. Ajita's own hair was probably as long as Goshala's, but it was well groomed, washed, fragrant, combed and tied. Goshala clearly did not adhere to any rules of grooming. When it was noon and the sun was exactly overhead, Goshala came out of his self-imposed silence. He greeted Maitreya warmly. Maitreya, I am so happy to see you. Who is this you bring along with you? Ajita was surprised and happy to find out that when Maitreya mentioned his name to Goshala, he recognized it immediately. I've been hearing a lot about you, Ajita, he said. Rumor is that you debated and won against Somadatta. That's commendable. There are many people saying really good things about you. It's wonderful. These old systems need to be challenged and brought down. And I'm an ally of anyone who's heading towards this goal. But tell me about your own position. I hear you commit yourself to materialism. Ajita summarized his philosophical position, his materialism, and his adherence to a philosophy which is grounded in the observable external world. Then I guess you're an atomist. You have to realize that atoms first came to be, the idea of atoms first came to be just around this time. Okay, so it was very, very, very exciting new concept in Greece at that time with Leucippus and Democritus. And here in India also, different systems, especially the Vaisheshikas and the Jain philosophies, but also some Buddhist schools were serious atomists. Okay. So it's somewhat debatable whether Ajivikas were atomists. There are different positions that philosophers take on it. But here I'm taking the position that Makkhali Goshala was committed to being an atomist. So he says, then I guess you're an atomist. I have accepted the reality of atoms. Everything we have around us is made up of these indivisible units, and I find that fascinating. Atoms are governed by their own cosmic laws, how they move, how they come together to create the composite world that we live in, including our own cells, how they interact and cohere. We believe that we are able to exert our will and act freely, but in that substratum, there are processes happening that are beyond our control. As individuals, our freedom to act only has small local consequences. On a cosmic scale, none of this matters because that is completely determined by the laws that govern the atoms. Of course, most people don't understand this or don't want to, and instead caricature me as a fatalist, said Goshala, smiling. I find the idea of atoms an attractive possibility, but I'm uncomfortable with the fact that they are not observable. So Ajita was very, very strict of saying, very much like modern science, wanting to root everything he says in observable entities. I can accept the fact that everything is made of elements because these elements in themselves are observable, right? You seem to be too worried about observables. Yes, I am, because I feel if we give up that, then anything goes. We need to be grounded in the reality of the world we live in. What is the world we live in? We, you or I, do we live in the same world? Of course we do, says Ajita, bit agitated. Your world does not account for my dreams, my fears, my anxieties, or even something as real as my toothache. But that is your subjective experience. We all agree on a world, an external objective world, don't we? Pay attention to dreams, to the world that's spread out in your dreams. You don't practice any austerities, do you? No, I don't see any point in doing them. So the Ajivika system was full of rituals and austerities. And again, the Cārvākas didn't believe in any of that. So then Makkhali says, you have to learn to be a shramana. I tell you this, stay without food or water for 10 days and 10 nights at a stretch, and you will see your world changing. Extend that the next time to 20 days and 20 nights, and you will see another world altogether. What are you saying? That is not even sensible. I am saying you live the comfortable life of a city dweller. Have the courage to give that up. I tell you that when I have stayed without food or water for 40 days, I have seen beings and creatures you can't even imagine. Those are called hallucinations. And because you have a name for them, they don't exist. I have seen them, and why should anyone tell me that my experience is not true? I have heard stories about you, Goshala, fasting for 40 days at a stretch and having nothing more than a dry stone to rub your tongue on. I'm sure your mind starts playing games when you push yourself to that extreme. But it proves nothing. Meanwhile, you and I can both see that tree right now, and that is a given. There is no disputing it. We have only agreed that my sensory experience and yours actually coincide. And it's just one tree. How are we going to verify that that is true? Also, if I were to go off to sleep now, then my tree would disappear. What about yours? You're going only by the experience of the conscious world. But there is a world that is beyond the conscious. There are other states of existence. There are meditative states where one can experience the dance of the atoms. The world of experience is the world of your experience. And if you do not account for your experience, then that is simply an abstraction. Don't get misled by gross materiality. There is the bamboo of the veena and its strings. But beyond that, there is the sound. What is the sound of the veena? It is not the vibrations of the string, nor the vibrations of the air that the sound passes through. It is not even the vibrations of the inner ear that receives the sound. It is none of these gross material entities. I still believe it is material, but not in the way you conceive it. And then dwell on the fact that you can dream of a veena. You can even feel its wood in a dream, but you can also hear its music in a dream. There are words and worlds. I don't understand what you're saying. Don't try to. Just hear the veena's sound. Just remember your dreams. Okay, I'll stop there. So is there anything you would want to ask me, or should I continue? Or is there any questions?
This is Sridhar.
Yeah.
First of all, thank you for the Georges Perec mention in the book. I'm a huge Oulipo fan, and I was really happy that you had.
That's so nice to hear. Thank you.
I also found it very interesting that you had like Gautam and like Mahavir meet, and I mean my question is probably this, which is you've constructed several philosophical spaces in the book, in the sense that spaces where you can talk about philosophy or some idea is coming in contact with something else, and the sort of interaction between Gautam and Mahavir, every time that it happens, I think it happens like 2 or 3 times in the book. it's very, I mean, it doesn't actually matter to the rest of the story. And it's actually not, it's not that non-trivial either. Like, they talk about quite ordinary things. In fact, one would think that with such huge, of intellectuals of such stature meeting, it would be like a clash of worlds or clash of ideas, but that actually doesn't happen. Most of the time they talk about something and then go back to their own lives. And this happens several times actually throughout the book in other instances as well. So I'm wondering if you think that there is an ideal sort of a philosophical space that can be constructed in that sense. The reason I ask this question is, so for example, in the large sabha that Ajita takes part in later, right? So he's talking about precisely what his ideas are, but then in a similar sabha later, when they're with the king, they in fact murky the waters with some of their ideas. They go out in the more negative direction because they don't want that sort of state patronage for their ideas, right? So in that sense, one of the philosophical spaces is more authentic and the other is sort of fraught and polluted in a certain sense.
Yes.
And in the other sense, so when you talk about, when Gautama actually accepts the patronage of the king, there's a part where Ajita says that, oh, I didn't really expect him to do that. That's not really in his nature. But then the clashes that he has with these other philosophers are, to me at least, more authentic. Whereas, for example, if you consider Shankar or Madhavacharya, the logical battles that they were having were more in a hermeneutic sense. They were talking about the Vedas and the religious texts, but they weren't really talking about the more base materialism. Sorry, I just asked a really long-winded question. My question is that, do you think that there is an ideal philosophical space, because you've constructed so many in your book?
Oh, yeah, that was a great question, in fact. But I'll pick up one thread and respond to that. I think this idea, how do philosophers talk when they meet? Okay, so that is one thing to ponder about. The other thing is, are their battles only purely intellectual battles? And actually I differ with you on this Shankara versus Madhavacharya thing, because Madhavacharya really spews venom sometimes at Shankara, okay, calling him a crypto-Buddhist, and he actually says it's safer to be with Buddhists than to be with this person who is a demon in disguise and all that, right? But the thing is, I also wanted to make these figures very, very human, okay? And this whole strategy that they develop when they go to meet Ajatashatru. So this whole story is there in this Buddhist text about Ajatashatru. So, but it's a Buddhist text, so it's a Buddhist way of telling the story. So according to that story, Ajatashatru went through an existential crisis. He says, bring me the wisest people in my kingdom. And his ministers get him 6 wise men, all men unfortunately. And these 6 people talk to him, and what the Buddhist text says that they were saying is more or less what I have used in this thing. And then he rejects all of them. He doesn't find any solace in anything that they are saying. And then the next day, the story is that he meets the Buddha in the garden and they start talking. And so this story leaves a lot of gaps for me. So why if he was inviting all the wise men in his country, then why was the Buddha not there in the first place? Okay, that is a thing. Secondly, it's also very interesting to note that there is not a single person from the Vedic system, from the Orthodox system. So that also is a question I try to answer in that chapter. And so they strategize. They don't want to align with the king. Whereas in the Vidvat Sabha, where he is called, he's much more a philosopher there, trying to talk to another philosopher, debate with another philosopher. Whereas here, he is suspicious of the motives of the emperor. And because they are also very radical, they don't want to align with the state in any way. So that is why they both, that's the reason I felt that they said what they said. If the Buddhist text is recording them correctly enough, then the fact that they said things which sound, completely out of context and meaningless is, I attribute it to that. Yeah. And thanks for the Georges Perec thing. So might as well use that to tell everyone. So this Georges Perec is part of a group of writers. It was a group which was very prominent in the 60s and 70s, but it still exists. And this group is called the Oulipo. And these are, they're largely French, but a few others also. And these writers basically try to work on the form of the novel and use various ways of doing constrained writing. Okay. So in fact, Georges Perec also wrote a novel without using the letter E. It's a book called La Disparition in French, which is translated in English without the letter E by another very gifted person. Anyways, and there are other games that many of the, so there was Raymond Queneau who wrote a very complicated book of poems where you can actually turn, instead of turning the whole page, you can turn individual lines. And by taking combinations of these individual lines, he says you can make 100 million poems. Okay, so you can actually turn lines, and each page has one poem of 14 lines, and then when you turn individual lines, you make different combinations of poems and so on. So this kind of thing fascinates me. I am also that kind of a person. And like Raymond Queneau says, a Oulipian is a person who's, it's like a rat who is trying to escape from a labyrinth which it has created for itself. Okay, so the constraint I work with in this book is to not. So I write this book in 26 chapters, and in each chapter I leave out one letter of the alphabet. So that letter is not used at all in the chapter. So the first reading I did was from a chapter which has no A, and the one I read now, I think, is probably no L or something. But so in each chapter, I don't use one. And so that actually also connects with the content of the book, because in the book, actually, both from Moksh's life and in Ajita's story, not so much in Ajita's life itself, but people around him, people die, people go missing, a lot of disappearance that's happening there. So this missing alphabet actually speaks to the content also that way. Can I read something which is in fact from a very crucial part of the book where Moksh, who is living in Bombay, and this is 2005, 26 July in Bombay. There was very, very heavy rains and massive floods. When I say heavy rains, it's not the Bangalore kind of rain. It's serious Bombay rain. And so there was a lot of people who, in fact, were stranded, but quite a few even lost their lives in those floods. And so it is that story I go back to. Moksh is married to Geet, and the interesting thing was this rain actually was confined to the northern parts of Bombay. In South Bombay, there was no rain. So Moksh and Geet live in South Bombay, and Moksh is there, and Geet has gone to work to the northern part of the city, and she's caught in the floods. And when she calls him, he says, just get off the car and start walking to the train station. She says, you have no idea what you're talking about. And it actually happened. People like me who were in the southern part of the city had no clue what was going on in the north at that time. So I'll again start reading from the middle. After disconnecting the call, Moksh moves to the balcony and sits on the large swing that hangs from the door frame. It is Geet's favorite spot in the house. where she spends every morning with her cup of tea, listening to the birds chirping in the trees. Oh, just to let Bangalore people know that in Bombay there are birds and there are trees. Okay. It is that time of the evening now when the day is giving way to darkness, and in that crepuscular haze of twilight, as Moksh lies back, suspended in mid-air, he realizes that he is simultaneously occupying three boundaries: between the day and the night, between the earth and the sky, and between the inside and the outside. On the threshold, the limen, the domain of liminality. It is the failing light that often reveals the invisible, and it now becomes apparent to Moksh that there is also a fourth boundary that is staring him in the face, the one between life and death. This is the boundary that brings out most sharply the slippery character of Hermes, the messenger of Zeus, who is the god of the liminal, the lord of all boundaries, including the one between life and death. It is a boundary that is replete with deceit and illusion, but then Hermes is also the guide to the wayfarer, bidding him to take a turn, a hermeneutic turn, so as to be able to delve deeper into domains that are liminal. Okay, I think I'll stop it. Maybe I should also read something which is somewhat similar from. So I realized that I was writing this book in alternating chapters between Moksh and Ajita. And then the book does something strange. It loops back on itself. The first chapter of the book and the last chapter of the book are the same. But it's not quite the same, and I'll allow you to read it and figure out why it's not the same. That is left as an exercise for my students sitting here. So it's not like a serpent eating its own tail. It's more like a Mobius strip. What we call in mathematics a Mobius strip, which is if you take a piece of paper and instead of just joining the ends of the paper to make a circle, you can twist the paper and join it. And that's a very interesting surface named after a mathematician called Mobius. And this surface is interesting, but because like on a circle, if you were to take a pencil and go around that paper, that circular paper strip that you made, then the pencil, if it's outside, will remain outside. If it is inside, it will remain inside. But I think you should go and try this out. You take a Mobius strip, and if you move the pencil on the Mobius strip, it starts from the outside and goes into the inside and comes back to the outside. So there's no outside and inside on a Mobius strip. So in some sense that I'm playing with that idea also of externality and internality in this novel. And this novel loops back into itself with this Mobius strip kind of thing. But very often I found myself both sometimes consciously and sometimes somewhat subconsciously reflecting what is there in Moksh's story in Ajita's story, or what is there in Ajita's story in Moksh's story. So I've written already something, and I find myself coming back to that same theme again. I found a similarity here, which struck me later when I was reading it. And so I will read it and leave it for you. I read this part from. So I find some similarity between what I wrote there and what I'm going to read out now. Ajita has come back home after a long time because he's living in the city in Vaishali, and he's gone back to his village because his father was very unwell. And Ajita is also trained as a doctor, so he's taking care of his father. And but then after a point, his father dies. And I actually discuss in several pages, I've described the progression of the disease in his father. And again, what disease it is for you to guess by reading the book. But I actually followed the progression of a disease which we know now quite commonly. and described that. All the symptoms are described. If you have any knowledge of medicine, you'll figure out what I'm talking about. Anyway, so his father passes away, and then Ajita's stays for the funeral and for a few more days after that. And then he's planning to go back to Vaishali. But this is the scene just before he goes back. The next afternoon, Ajita was all set to leave for Vaishali. Dhwani is his mother. Dhwani would be leaving a couple of days later, with her setting off for a new life in the hills. The house that had been Ajita's all through his childhood would now be uninhabited and abandoned. As if to touch and feel what little the present had to offer, Ajita went and sat in the garden, under the tree that he had planted as a child. He had planted a mango tree when he was a child, and that's grown now. In the present, neither he nor the tree were what they had been when he was a child, and the tree only a seed. The tree had now grown to a great height, but its shadow changed length as the sun traversed the sky through the course of the day. It is the varying length of the shadow, however transient and fleeting, that keeps track of births and deaths, growth and decay. And because it is the shadow that is the scale that we are fated to use, the shadow of transitoriness is cast on our lives. Death is darkness, and in the darkness there is no shadow. I find some resonance between what I read earlier for Moksh and for Ajita. So it kept coming back like this in many places. So, how are we doing with time, Rajgopal?
No, but it's around 7:35. We are doing fine. If you have more questions, I
Is
think
there more questions? Are there more questions? That will be.
Yeah, just go.
Yes, Tenosh.
Hi. So 2 things. I really like the names of the characters you had in the book, like Chapa and Maya and all that. It was really good. Yeah. Another thing. Can I spoil some things in the book for people who haven't read? So when Goshala dies.
Spoiler alert.
Yeah. Spoiler alert. Yeah. So when Goshala dies, before he dies, he had asked his disciples to for his funeral, to hold a procession and also to like drag him by his hair on the street. I found it a bit bizarre. Was it? Did that actually happen in real life?
You won't believe it, but the most authoritative book on this subject, which is, as I told you, by Basham, that bit is exactly reproduced as it is there in that book. Exactly. Except for my playing my game and rewriting it in my own literary style. But the content is exact. You'll be surprised I had marked that page because I wanted to read that. And I think it's worth reading. A spot on the banks of the Achiravati river had been chosen for the funeral site. This is Makkhali Goshala's death being talked about. A spot on the banks of the Achiravati river had been chosen for the funeral site, and Makkhali had explicitly expressed his preference for a cremation over a burial. As for the rest of his instructions, they only managed to create a lot of confusion. In his last months, given to delirious ramblings, Makkhali had told his disciples that they should bathe his body in perfume, apply sandal paste, array it in the finest robes and ornaments, and mount it on a bier to be carried by 1,000 men in a procession through the streets of Shravasti, singing his praises before going to the riverbank for cremation. At other times, though, he insisted that they should desecrate his body, tie a rope to his left foot, spit on his face, and drag him through the streets of Shravasti, cursing him and declaring him to be a fake. In death as in life, said Ajita, as Makkhali's disciples described his last instructions. He lived in the extremes, and in death he sought the same. The disciples had also told him that Makkhali, for several days before his death, drank and danced to the beat of drums and died in that state of ecstasy. Ajita looked at the dead man's face and felt that a moment of that ecstasy had frozen forever on it. Some of these things are literally taken. I have not changed it. Very often I've changed things, or I've also tried to write it in very contemporary language, not used a very archaic language or something. But this is bizarre. I mean, that I agree with you. But he was that kind of person, I think. So,
It was really nice. You have a way with words. Yeah, nice book.
thank you.
There's one more question.
Sorry, I just remembered that I had to thank you for something else, which
Oh.
is the construction of Moksh's character, because I feel like most of my friends now, like closer friends nowadays, just can describe themselves as recovering Marxists, which Moksh also is. But anyway, my question is not really about the story of the novel, but so when, for example, like, the new materialists these days or object-oriented ontologists often use the idea of emergence as a larger explanatory theory for phenomena that otherwise seem quite magical. So for example, consciousness is described by new materialists as an emergent phenomena. So I'm wondering so for example, you talked about how proteins become DNA, and that is sort of an emergent behavior. The behavior of DNA rather is an emergent behavior. I'm wondering if you hold personally, because of like physics and everything, whether you think that all of these questions can be generalized in a way. I mean, that probably the cyberneticians already haven't done, which is, do you think that there can be in the future like an eminence of, for example, mathematical mereology in questions about such things? So for example, whether it's atoms causing redness in something else which you've described in the book, or proteins causing emergent behavior in DNA. Do you think these questions can be generalized in a way?
Thanks. I think you read the book very, very carefully, and I'm really grateful for that. So whether this will work everywhere, and whether emergence will be an idea that will apply universally, that is a difficult and tricky question to answer. So I wouldn't venture that far. But we already, for example, this. I find it quite fascinating. I tried to, Tenosh was in my class, and I tried to convey this in my quantum mechanics classes. So whenever you propose an idea of an atom, you are stuck with this problem. I mean, so atoms are these tiny entities which comprise everything. Everything is made up of atoms. That's what we say. And that's what Democritus and Leucippus also said. But the question is, then, is this table made up of brown atoms, and is that speaker made up of black atoms? And do we have blue atoms and green atoms, which make up blue and green things? Okay. And very early, both the Indian and the Greek philosophers realized that that cannot be the case. They did not know the answer, what the answer would be, but they realized that that will be just, it won't make any sense to replicate the entire variety of phenomena in the world of atoms. So they did think of this fact that we have to somehow figure out how atoms come together, but they didn't really state this also very clearly. But they knew the answer lay somewhere else. I feel that the Cārvākas go on to express this in the clearest way. Though they didn't pursue the idea of atoms, because they says, I don't want to do anything with atoms because they are not observable. Okay, and Ajita would have been probably happy these days that you can actually, measure things related to an atom in a laboratory, and it's part of the observable world. But coming back to this, what I find fascinating, and I have not gotten over this after being a physicist for the last 35 years, I find it fascinating that in our modern understanding of atoms in quantum mechanics, we start with atoms which actually have none of these properties. But for example, I showed them by a calculation in the class that you can actually figure out the color of a dye. So a chemical dye which is pink in color, and why it is pink is something that can come out of a calculation. That I find really quite fascinating. Again, whether this is not at all going to be as easy to explain life and consciousness and things in terms of
That's an astonishing fact, actually. Yeah.
what?
The fact that you can calculate color.
Yeah. Actually, we did this in class. I mean, it was a contrived example in the sense that I chose a specific example which could actually be done in class. But it's actually fascinating when you to think that. Yeah, but it's at least a way to go forward. If it's not, whether it's a universal methodology, I don't know, but one way to go forward with these ideas, I think. Thank you. Your questions are very provocative.
Any final? The classes at Azim Premji University is always very interesting. Any final questions for Professor Sridhar? We have time for maybe.
Wants to ask me something less nerdy, maybe.
Yeah, I mean,
something more to do with the book or.
One question: did you always had an idea of writing a fiction, or did you have an idea that you will write something in which is historical, philosophical, or was it always fiction? That's number one. Second question: how much time did you take to write this book? When did you really have the seed as an idea, and then?
The idea came this book. Okay, the first part of the question was actually addressed when I wrote my first novel, twice written. And that I started thinking about it in 2004. And luckily I happened to come to Bangalore. I was living in Bombay at that time. I happened to come to visit for an official visit to IISc. And there I happened to meet this professor of literature, Meenakshi Mukherjee, who was also visiting that place for a few days. And somehow in the conversation with her, she said, like, go ahead and write. And, and so that kind of gave me some, courage to go ahead and do it. The reason I think I wanted to write fiction is that literature allows me to talk about things which, all my work in physics does not allow me to talk about. So the whole idea of affect, human affect, I mean, the idea of emotions and what one goes through, life experiences, the love that you feel for someone, the pain that you feel in someone's death, all those things. How am I going to ever write it in terms of my equations? No? So that needed to be expressed somewhere. So this novel had to be written. Twice Written was a very important novel for me. At the end, when I finished Twice Written, already I started getting some idea of writing about the Cārvākas. I happened to go to Dharamshala at that time, and a lot of that is actually there in the book. This place called Bir that I discussed, we went there for a few days and I write about that. What struck me was that in Tibetan Buddhism as it's practiced today, the idea of rebirth and past lives and future lives is a very, very it's very tangible and exists very strongly in that society. So, I mean, broadly speaking, we Hindus also have ideas of, past and future lives. But, I mean, when we ask this, we just shrug it off, or if someone forces us to answer it, we kind of will just laugh and say, no, these were things in the past. We are now very modern people, we don't believe. It's not quite like that with the Tibetans living in Dharamshala. Their society, their relations with other people, societal relations, the hierarchies in that society are all determined by what they were in the past. Right. So, I may be teaching Tenosh in APU now, but if we have both reached that level of, that level in meditation to be able to recount our past lives, and if I realize that Tenosh was my guru in some previous life, whenever I meet him, I'll touch his feet. It is literally like that. So I was finding this a very stark contrast in 2008. To think that in 2500 years ago, people like Ajita were laughing their heads off, saying, what rubbish is this? There is no life beyond this, and this is where it ends. So this is the Mobius strip in my novel, because in the penultimate chapter, Ajita dies, and even as he is dying, he says, this is it, this is over, I'm going. And don't grieve over my death, and this is the natural order, and I'm dying. And he dies saying this, that there is no coming back. And then the last chapter is suggesting, and it's all suggestive, that he comes back as Moksh. So Moksh is recounting his past lives through Buddhist meditative techniques, and he goes through a series of lives, which takes him through 4 lives, and the 5th life that is Ajita's life. So it's kind of, that is the loop that we are caught in this book.
Thank you.
Can I read one very small bit in the end, just to...
And now the name Moksh makes sense now.
So Moksh is... he starts like, as a friend said, he's a son of a Marxist father. But he, after his wife dies, he goes to Bir and Dharamshala and gets into Buddhist meditative practices and so on. So, and then he believes that he can recollect his past lives. And so he documents them through 4 of them. One is in the early part of the 20th century, he's a doctor in Moksh is a doctor in Amritsar. Then in the something like the 13th century, he's a young girl in Orissa. Then 7th century, he's a Dalit working in the graveyard, not graveyard, sorry, a crematorium. And then even before that, he's like in the turn of the millennium, he is a woman in Tamil Nadu. And so she is a theatre person who has moved to certain kind of tantric practices. So these are the 4 lives that is described. I'll just take the one in Amritsar and read a little about. This person is Amritsar is doctor. And as he is living in Amritsar, you would expect his name to be Dr. Singh, which it is. But the twist is that he is not just Dr. Singh, he is Dr. Samuel Singh. He is a Punjabi, but he is Christian. Okay. And Samuel loses his grandfather at a very young age, and he never gets over it. And with the death of his grandfather, he loses his faith. He stops going to the church, and he does not believe in God anymore. And he grows up and then becomes a doctor, and he works. So he's treating a young boy called Kake, and Kake is affected with polio. And polio treatment in those days, so I actually did some research on what the level of treatment in polio 1915 was. And there were some small breakthroughs which were helping people not to completely get cured, but to, be able to manage walking and so on. So he's reading those American research articles and trying that on Kake. And working with Kake for 3 years or 4 years, he manages to really get him to walk, and So he suggests that he should go for regular walks. So Kake and Kake's mother go for a walk in the garden, and then they go for, like every evening they go for this walk, and that evening they go, and there is a lot of festivity going on. So they were going and watching that festivity, and suddenly police, surround that place, and then there is firing that starts. And this is General Dyer, and this is Jallianwala Bagh, and that boy dies in that firing. So this is the last piece of that chapter. Since his Dadaji died, Samuel has never been inside a church. He is awkward. He has no idea why he came here. Some force from inside him working unconsciously has dragged him here. He finds a place in a back pew and closes his eyes. He's all alone, so when he hears someone coming, he's surprised. Reverend Ross looks down and says, "Why, fancy seeing you here. I would have never." A look of hopelessness in Samuel's eyes makes him pause. "Are you well, Dr. Singh?" he asks. Samuel can find no answer. "I'm vanquished," he says finally. Vanquished. Yes, vanquished by a God. I give up. I believed we have agency, we have power. No, we are powerless and unavailing. "Did you lose somebody?" Graham asks, placing a hand on Samuel's shoulder. "Yes, someone I was caring for and helping recover from a crippling disease. A child who had a whole life ahead of him. And I was hoping he would walk, Graham. I was doing all I could. Of course, one knows success in such endeavors is never assured. One can only hope for success and prepare for failure. However, how can one prepare for failure if one has no idea how one can fail? If he could never walk even when I had done all I could do medically, I would say I have failed and would have been equanimous in my failure. No, here I am doing all I can and I am approaching my goal inch by inch, and suddenly he is gone. Someone fires a gun and kills him, which makes no sense." He pauses and adds, "I was 11 years old when I asked God for his help. Someone I loved dearly was dying, and I prayed for him. For 9 whole days I prayed. My prayers were useless. My loved one died, and alongside him, God died for me. I became a man of science, believed in science, and looked for hope in science. Now I see no hope in religion or in science, in belief or in reason. I can see only an absurd face mocking me."
Wow. Thank you.
Sorry to end on that note.
Yeah, but still, it's indeed thought-provoking. Any final questions? I think we're running short of time. It's amazing how you've brought in history into that, what we are calling fiction. So, yeah, I think there's one last question here. Yes.
I have not read your book, in fact. So, but being a physicist, how it brought to you to the philosophy of Indians, and then like you have combined so much that is clearly visible from the talk. What I could guess that you have read a lot of philosophical things, starting from the beginning to now. What is going on, and means what it brought you to the philosophy of India.
Not just India, I've been reading philosophy for a very long time, something that has interested me. At some point when I was planning to do my master's, I had to actually make a choice between whether I want to do physics or whether I want to do philosophy. But I mean, I believe that what you do in life should not completely limit you and define you. If you're a chartered accountant, I mean, does not mean that you have somehow internalized chartered accountancy, that you will not be able to talk about anything else. You can be a chartered accountant with an interest in music or with an interest in films. You can be a police inspector who's writing reviews of cinema or whatever. I mean, I think people should allow, I'm talking about APU education maybe, but people should allow their best. I don't think we should stop at exploring. That's my belief. It's not about being experts at things, but that we should never cease from exploring, as T.S. Eliot said.
Thank you. I think on that note, a round of applause for Professor Sridhar here. Thank you, Sridhar, for this wonderful. I mean, not because the books are the books are here. I'm really tempted to buy and understand the Mobis trip. Thank you for being a wonderful audience. When you have the lesser people, we have much more nicer, intimate conversation. But we should continue. I think Professor Sridhar is going to be here for some more time. So that's it from us for today. Tomorrow we are meeting again for a kind of different, very different performance called Yellamma and Other Stories, Urban Folk Project. Shilpa Mubdi and Aditya will be performing here. So if you want to come back, do come back. And if you want to join our mailing list, do let us know. There'll be a program every week, if not more than one program. So have a wonderful Saturday. I sincerely hope you don't get stuck in traffic. Thank you so much. Thank you.